The Invest in Her podcast is brought to you in part by Wells Fargo Bank. Hi, I'm Catherine Gray, founder of She Angel Investors and co-founder of the She Angels Foundation. I'm also the podcast host of Invest in Her and an award-winning producer, author, and TEDx speaker. Our show, Invest in Her, features phenomenal female founders and funders. As you know, women receive less than 2% of venture capital funding. Our series is about accelerating the funding of women by connecting them to funding resources. Let's meet today's guest. Welcome to this week's episode of Invest in Her. I'm your host, Catherine Gray, founder of She Angel Investors and co-founder of the She Angels Foundation. And more recently, just produced a film called Show Her the Money. And it is all about women in venture capital. So I'm so excited to have on today a woman who is well known in the venture capital market. She is the vice president over at Illumen Capital. Please welcome to the show, Joanna Kuang. How are you, Joanna?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. So excited to be on today.
Thank you. I'm so glad because every week we like to have on women that are in this space that are either funding women or women getting funded. And so excited to talk to you today because I know you're just such a big advocate of getting money in the hands of women, BIPOC, LGBTQ, all the underserved communities in this arena. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's interesting about working at a fund of funds and specifically doing DEI work at a fund of funds, so not being like a separate DEI consultant, but instead doing that work within a specific investment vehicle, is basically I'm a woman that's both getting funded, but also channeling capital. So it's a very interesting part of the market.
That is. So let's talk about that a minute because that's an interesting niche. And I always like to put things in lay terms so that my audience understands. Otherwise, we're always talking over everybody's head and they're like, what? What are they talking about? I'm turning this off. I don't know what they're talking about. So let's talk about it. Let's just start with what DEI is. Let's tell everybody what that means.
Yeah, definitely. And I appreciate this because I think a lot of language can be super exclusionary. I always tell people I work with and coach, why not just say what you're actually trying to say rather than using all these buzzwords that only we know? So yeah, DEI refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's a very big umbrella bucket, I think, to cover a lot of things. But ultimately, for us at Illumen Capital and for my work, it's really about changing how people see diversity. So who's represented in terms of who works in investing and who works in entrepreneurship, equity, so changing processes in terms of whether or not they're fair and equitable, and then inclusion. So even if you have different people who look different at the table, are they actually being heard? Do they actually feel a sense of belonging?
Love that. And then let's talk about what do you mean by fund of funds? Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so fund of funds is a vehicle that basically is we're investors, so we're taking capital that we manage from big institutions like endowments and foundations and pensions or wealthy individuals. And we're basically investing those dollars into other funds. So those are funds that ultimately would be the people who would invest in the startups of tomorrow. So venture capital funds primarily, but also some growth equity and private equity, basically all different stages of startups. So basically, we're kind of playing that middle layer between pools of a lot of financial capital, like a pension or an endowment, and funding investors who are ultimately making decisions on which startups should get funding.
So you're investing in, say, women-founded funds,
Exactly.
people of color funds, LGBTQ funds. You invest in those funds that they then can deploy to the individuals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the hope is instead of just us investing in, say, 30 companies that are startups, we're getting to invest in, say, 10 funds, but each of them might have 30 companies. So we're kind of getting to influence people who are controlling money's behavior and kind of change some of the power dynamics about what it looks like to control dollars in a way that is diverse. So going towards more women and people of color and other underrepresented folks, but also changing kind of what it looks like to be the people in the room.
I love that. So you're a woman-founded fund. You're trying to raise the money Illumen Capital is one of the places you could go to try to get money to help raise that fund. Is that correct?
Yes.
I love that. I love what you're doing. That must be like one of the greatest jobs ever.
Yeah, I think it's really great. I think it's really great that we're seeing a lot more attention being paid to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the value of having different perspectives. But that being said, we know that there's a stat that says that only 1.3% of all dollars in the world that are managed by either women or people of color. So we definitely still have a long way to go to match, for example, the census or the broader representation of the public, even just the American public. Um,
100%. And I want to talk about your background a little bit too, because I see that you had worked in like governmental dollars and where those are distributed. And I had a conversation with someone the other day that, government dollars are put into venture capital funds, and women make up more than 51% of the population. They are our tax dollars, and yet they're still just deployed very little bit to women and women funds. How are we going to change that? I mean, for me, we made a movie called Show Her the Money. We're taking it on the road. We're educating people. But you coming from this business, you're in those trenches. How do you think we're going to change it being deployed to more diverse groups?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really great point. So, yeah, before I was working at a company called Third Sector, and basically we were bringing government dollars to be more aligned with private and philanthropic dollars. And I thought that that was really interesting because right now, those different pools of capital, government is working very separately from private banks, is working often very separately from like a foundation or a philanthropy that's giving grants. So it was really interesting to kind of see them all come together. And one of the things that we leaned on in that space, it was focused on outcomes-based financing. So it was all about aligning on what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve and using data to kind of make the point that they were being successful. And I think that that way of thinking, that set of principles, is really important to keep in mind in the venture capital space, where now at Illumin, we're primarily focused on the money that we manage. But I think acknowledging that we have a lot of power in terms of shaping the broader narrative and showing kind of an example of success. So our goal is really, can we show that taking the efforts to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion and invest in more diverse managers actually does lead to success? Because then that's kind of a case study or a pilot of like, this actually works. And so I think that that's a strong case to invest in impact measurement as a way to really make the case. Because I think so many people who are women and people of color spend so much time convincing others of their worth rather than being able to do the work. They don't have the psychological safety and trust to be able to just actually do the work. So we end up spending more time just proving our worth or proving that we belong in the market at all. And so the more that we at Illumin can kind of use data to show that it is working, I think is a really powerful narrative for the rest of the field to not have to spend as much time convincing big investors that investing in diverse managers or diverse led companies is worth it.
This is brilliant. Who started Illumen Capital, and how did you get involved?
Yeah, so we were founded by our managing director, Darren Dodson. He previously worked at Calvert Impact and led a number of funds there. Um, and I actually got involved. I was our third hire in 2020. So actually in June 2020, shortly after a number of folks were kind of reawakening to the Black Lives Matter movement, Illumin had already been doing this work and been out in the market for over a year. And we had published basically a research paper that showed that through a academically rigorous methodology, when you keep everyone's track record the same but only change race, investors, real life investors, are more likely to invest in and more comfortable investing in white managers than Black managers. So it showed that race affects investor judgment, even when the track record and everything else is the same. So kind of using that thesis around and research around race, obviously also extremely, extremely relevant to gender. We basically got our start, but really saw a lot more attention being paid after investors kind of revisited or reflected upon their own racial and gender biases in the wake of Black Lives Matter in 2020. And so I've been here for the past 3.5 years, leading our work and kind of adding to the structures of in terms of how we support our fund managers in reducing their biases and increasing DEI.
That's great. So about do you know how many funds you all have invested in?
Yeah, so we are about as of the end of last year, as of the end of 2023, we're at about around 20 fund managers that we've invested in across three vehicles. And some of those funds are further along than other funds, but I think that's also part of the beauty of being able to create a community of fund managers who can also support one another in this work. I think we know there's this concept, the Rooney Rule, that a lot of people like to implement in hiring, where it's like having at least one woman or person of color in the final candidate pool comes from the NFL. But that's not enough because that often leads to tokenization. So there's this concept called the rule of two, which shows that if you just have two women or people of color in the final candidate pool, it actually increases the chances that a woman or person of color is hired by almost 50%. So I think that shows the power of community. And for us, that's something we want our fund managers to experience, not doing this work alone or feeling like you're being put in this box to satisfy someone's diversity initiative, but really that you're a part of a strong community of people who are trying to do similar work.
Love that. It must be so gratifying.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's the concept of like the rising tide, right? Which actually Rising Tide is a book in about the Mississippi River that I read when I was living and teaching in the Mississippi Delta. And that's kind of where a lot of my um interest in impact investing when I was still an undergraduate comes from because was living in a town that was basically still segregated and saw the difference that even a small amount of financial and social capital can make. And so kind of then and there, I was like, I need to commit my privilege, my ability to speak this language, like say those buzzwords, to really drive capital to impact. Because honestly, a lot of dollars are kind of paternalistic in terms of like they're investing in what they think is valuable rather than what people are telling you is valuable on the grounds. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there.
And do you know what percentage of aluminum capital funds that you all invest in are women? Because I imagine it's a combination of women, BIPOC, and LGBTQ.
Yeah, yeah. I would have to dig through some of the stats. It's been a while since we did our published our 2022 annual impact report last summer. And we're actually gearing up to publish that information now. But because we do self-reported data, we don't want to assume anybody's kind of race or gender in terms of the new funds that we've onboarded. So I'd have to look at those numbers. But for as of end of 2022, we um 90% of our funds were led by a woman or underrepresented person of color. So we define that as Black, Latinx, or Indigenous. Um, had at least one general partner that fell into one of those identities. So that really shows the power of diversity in our broader community. And then if we look at only a person of color or woman, 100% of our fund managers had at least one general partner, so like senior leader that identified as a woman or person of color.
That's fantastic. And how has the success of these 20 or so funds that you all have funded, how are they doing? Is it proving to be a successful formula? Um, Tell me a little bit about whatever you can share with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we do have like privacy agreements and whatnot in place in terms of sharing kind of more of the data. We're definitely hoping to continue, like I said, sharing more data that makes the case that DEI has a relationship or may have a relationship with financial returns and with impact at scale. But that being said, we're really seeing, I think, a lot of investments in what we consider more sticky processes. So rather than, hiring a person of color and then kind of using moral licensing and saying, okay, we're done, we've done it, right? Like we increased our diversity. We really want people to focus more on the equity part of DE&I because that's how you'll change processes over a long time period and almost change culture because now that's what's considered normal in terms of someone's behavior. So a lot of the changes that we're seeing that are really working are one, using data. So understanding more about your pipeline and your process, like where are diverse founders dropping off in terms of your process. Like maybe a lot of diverse founders are reaching out, but for some
Mhm.
reason, your diligence process makes it so that it's actually very hard for them to receive an investment in the end. Um, or we'll see a lot of attempts at standardizing certain elements of a process. So just like using standardized interview questions during hiring with regards to investing, we know that there's research that shows that in pitch competitions, men get asked more questions about upside and opportunity, whereas women get asked more questions about downside and risk. And so obviously that changes the tenor and tone of the conversation. If you only have 20 minutes with an investor and they're asking you, oh, how are you going to manage risks? It's very hard for you to talk about the moonshot opportunity and where you see it being in 10 years if it were successful, because the investor is kind of setting the tone that they're assuming you're going to have a lot of risks to manage just because you're a woman. And so for us, we've worked with a lot of the funds that we invested in. And how do you come up with like standardized questions, for example, in your first meeting with founders, so that everyone has a fair shot of at least starting their relationship with you as a potential investor.
Right.
So this kind of process is what we've been working on with our funds on.
That's great that you're leveling the playing field with those questions. That's so important. How long has Illumin been around?
So we were started in late 2018, but really we closed our first fund in 2020.
Okay. So 2020. So it's relatively new. It's a wonderful concept. It'll be great to see where it goes. If someone's out there and they're a fund manager and they're a woman or BIPOC founded or LGBTQ, can they come pitch you all to get some funding for their fund? Is this an ongoing process right now?
Yeah, it's an ongoing process. And one thing also that is similar to what I shared about what we do with our funds, we try to put a lot of those same processes in place. So we have a standardized pre-diligence form for everyone who reaches out. And what we're trying to do is enable cold outreach because warm outreach really requires you to have the networks. And often that goes back to high school and college. Like, did you grow up somewhere where you know someone who can connect you with one of the few people who works at Illumin, for example? And that's not very equitable. And so we want to make it so that people who don't have like a connection that they went to business school with or something still have an opportunity to be looked at in the same manner. And so we have a pre-diligence form that is on our website, or if someone reaches out to anyone on our team, we'll always send them the pre-diligence form and say that's our starting place. Like we have a standardized scorecard that we use for the pre-diligence form. Doesn't matter if it's your best friend of 20 years or someone that you've never met before. And so that's kind of how we try to create an equitable process up front in terms of inviting diverse managers to.
I love that. So it's open to anyone. And so this particular niche is called a funding of funds,
Yeah, exactly. A fund of funds.
a fund of funds. A
Yep.
fund of funds, yeah. No, I always like people to learn about new aspects of this venture capital world. So there are funds out there like yours that fund funds, not direct entrepreneurs. And
Exactly.
then by doing that, I love the process. You fund the fund, then they go and fund 10, 20, 30 different companies. So that way, the 20 that you have right now are all funding 10 or 20 or 30 companies. And this really helps to really expand the possibilities with the funding that you get. Now, where do you get your funding from? From individuals? They invest in your fund and then you deploy it to the funds?
Yeah, individuals, endowments, foundations, pensions, family offices. So basically any sort of bigger institutions that are looking for people to manage their dollars.
Love it. Love it. Well, this is amazing. What a wonderful conversation. Always love to tell people about new things that are in the venture capital world that maybe they haven't heard about. And this is wonderful. And I love that you're doing this. It's so important to leveling the playing field. We need more firms like Aluminum, but so happy that you're doing this. And what an amazing opportunity for some of these up and coming funds. So thank you all so much. And Joanna, so nice to meet you. Thanks for sharing your story. Any words of advice for someone starting a fund?
Um, yeah, I think signaling and building that relationship in both directions is really important. So for us as a fund, we try to signal that we have mechanisms to create equity to invite diverse managers. And I definitely would recommend that diverse managers find investors that are values aligned with them and are going to be able to provide that social capital as well beyond the financial capital in terms of introductions to other potential investors, introductions to interesting companies that will really be able to support them scaling for a long time. And then I think also for junior staff members who are maybe not in a leadership position right now, but one day hope to be, we make our kind of toolkit and curriculum in terms of how we train fund managers available to all of them. And I just encourage junior team members to tap into their individual power to create culture change at their firms, regardless of if it's a diverse-led firm or a less or like a more homogenous firm. I think that there's a lot of power that junior team members can have to have more bottoms-up change as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the social capital because I do believe it's all about connecting and building relationships. And every good entrepreneur or fund manager, that needs to be their focus, 100%.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you
Well,
so much for having me.
thank you. Can we find where do we find Illumen Capital on social?
Yeah, primarily we use LinkedIn. We have a Twitter as well. It's less active. So definitely LinkedIn or on our website, where we try to be very responsive as well to email.
Great. And that's illumencapital.com.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you can find Joanna Kuang on a LinkedIn. I'm going to spell her name for you in case you're just listening in and not watching. So it's Kuang.
Hmm.
You can find her on LinkedIn. You can find me, Catherine Gray, on LinkedIn as well. And on Instagram, we do have Catherine Gray, Invest in Her. We have two websites. Our website is She Angel Investors. If you want to learn more about having resources to help you find money or invest money. And then, as Joanna knows, we were just talking about this, showherthemoneymovie.com. We're going on a 50-city tour. We're probably going to be in your city. It helps women learn and people, men and women, learn about venture capital in the simplest of terms, but with engaging and fascinating storytelling that helps you really learn about how exciting and how amazing and how impactful it is. So check us out, showherthemoneymovie.com, and be sure to check out Illumen Capital. Make it a great day, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you, Joanna, for being a great guest.
Thanks so much for having me.